The morning sun was barely visible through the thick haze that hung over Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. It was already hot and sticky, the kind of summer day that promised to get worse before it got better. Passengers shuffled through the terminal, dragging rolling suitcases and balancing coffees, sleep still clinging to their eyes. Among the many travelers boarding Flight 276 to Portland, Oregon, was Malcolm Andrews, a bright-eyed 9-year-old black boy with boundless energy and a backpack almost half his size. He clutched his mother's hand tightly as they approached the gate. "Mom, do you think we'll see real mountains?" Malcolm asked, eyes sparkling with excitement. "We just might," said Camille Andrews, smiling down at her son. "There are plenty of them in Oregon. Maybe even some with snow on top." Malcolm gasped. "In summer?" Camille chuckled. "Yes, baby. It stays cold up there. You'll see." This trip wasn't just a vacation, it was a long-awaited visit to see Camille's younger sister, who had recently moved to Portland. It was Malcolm's first time flying. He had spent weeks researching planes and watching videos of takeoffs. He could recite safety instructions like a pro, and his enthusiasm was as infectious as it was genuine. They boarded near the front of the plane, greeted by a smiling flight attendant who complimented Malcolm's Spider-Man t-shirt. "Nice shirt, buddy," she said. "Thanks. He's my favorite." Malcolm replied proudly, before climbing into his seat by the window. Camille sat beside him, helping him buckle his seatbelt. His legs swung excitedly as he looked out the small oval window, watching luggage carts and busy airport staff bustle around on the tarmac. A few rows ahead sat Greg Mathers, a middle-aged white man dressed in a crisp white shirt and khakis. His carry-on bag was already stowed neatly above, and he sat with his hands tightly clasped on the tray table, staring straight ahead. There was something hard about him, his jawline rigid, his posture stiff. His eyes, hidden behind aviator sunglasses, occasionally flicked toward other passengers boarding the plane. When his gaze briefly landed on Camille and Malcolm, his lips thinned. He muttered something under his breath. No one heard him. In seat 16C, across the aisle from Malcolm and 2 rows behind, sat Julian Briggs, a tall, quiet man with a calm demeanor. Dressed casually in a plain blue t-shirt and jeans, Julian blended in easily. But there was a depth to his presence, a subtle intensity that couldn't be missed by those who looked closer. Julian had recently retired from the Marine Corps, where he served 2 tours and worked in security detail overseas. Years of training in high-risk deployments had given him a sixth sense and ability to read people, anticipate threats, and act under pressure. As more passengers filed onto the plane, Julian's attention swept naturally over the cabin. His eyes paused when they landed on Greg. Something about the man's posture set off a quiet alert in Julian's mind: the tightly drawn shoulders, the shallow breathing, the hands clenched just a bit too hard. Greg's stare was cold, almost hostile, when Malcolm burst out laughing at something he saw out the window, a man in a banana costume dancing near a food truck just off the runway. "That guy's nuts," Malcolm said, pointing and giggling. "He's really dancing in a banana suit." Camille smiled and tried to gently lower his volume. "Keep your voice down, baby. Not everyone's awake yet." Malcolm nodded but couldn't help a few more chuckles. The innocent joy radiating from him filled the air with something light. Something pure. Greg's nostrils flared. He turned slightly in his seat and grumbled under his breath, "Can't they ever just be quiet?" Julian didn't hear the words exactly, but he noted the body language: the tightening grip on the tray table, the slight tilt of Greg's head, the contempt in his jawline. He made a mental note and looked toward Malcolm, who was now examining the safety card with serious focus. "Mom," Malcolm whispered, "did you know the oxygen masks drop down if the cabin pressure goes away?" "Yes, sweetie," Camille said gently. "But don't worry, that's very rare." Greg closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, as if even a whisper from the boy across the aisle was intolerable. Julian, pretending to scroll through his phone, subtly turned his attention toward the front of the plane. He had seen this kind of tension before boiling under the surface, just waiting for a reason to explode. He wasn't alarmed yet, but his instincts told him to stay vigilant. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, checking seatbelts and closing overhead bins. The cabin crew gave the usual safety demonstration, though most passengers only half-watched. Malcolm, of course, watched every second like it was a live performance. He mimicked the motions with his hands as they explained how to fasten a seatbelt and where the exits were located. Julian couldn't help but smile faintly at the boy's enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for takeoff," the pilot announced. Estimated flight time to Portland is 3 hours and 22 minutes. The plane began taxiing. Malcolm's eyes widened as the aircraft sped up, and then suddenly they were off the ground. He gasped, then laughed. "We're flying, Mom. We're really flying." Camille smiled, stroking his hand. "Yes, baby. We're in the sky now." Across the aisle, Greg stiffened. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he shook his head with visible irritation. Julian caught the movement. His eyes sharpened. Something told him this man Greg wasn't just having a bad day. He was carrying something darker. A bitterness that didn't belong on a plane full of families and strangers simply trying to get somewhere. Julian sat up straighter, shifting slightly in his seat. His senses, honed by years of duty, moved from idle to alert. Just in case. Because sometimes trouble didn't announce itself with a bang. Sometimes, it started with a look. A breath. A whisper of hatred. And that was all it needed to grow. 30 minutes into the flight, the hum of the engines became a kind of background lullaby. Passengers settled into their routines. Some scrolled through movies on the seatback screens, others closed their eyes and drifted into light naps. A few typed away on laptops, the soft tapping of keys adding to the quiet rhythm of the cabin. Malcolm had his tray table down, coloring in a comic book his aunt had mailed him weeks earlier. "Do you think Auntie Rhonda will like this drawing?" he asked. Camille glanced at it, smiling. "She'll love it. You always use the brightest colors." Malcolm beamed. But across the aisle, Greg Mathers simmered. Each soft giggle from the boy. Every whispered question. Even the gentle murmur of Camille's responses, it all grated on him like sandpaper against raw skin. He stared ahead, face expressionless, but his eyes darted sideways every few seconds. Julian Briggs, still a few rows back, had noticed. The way Greg tapped his foot. The occasional clenched jaw. The subtle but growing agitation. He had seen this before on crowded buses overseas, in markets filled with tension. Anger didn't always scream. Sometimes it sat quietly, waiting for its moment. Julian unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, stretching as if to relieve a cramp. Slowly, he walked up the aisle, past Greg's row. As he passed, he let his eyes quickly scan the man's hands, posture, expression. He caught the faint tightening of Greg's neck muscles as Malcolm laughed again. He stopped near the galley to ask for water, but in truth, he simply needed a reason to pause nearby. Greg didn't make eye contact. But his knuckles were white where they gripped the armrest. When Julian returned to his seat, he leaned back, expression calm, but his mind was running scenario after scenario. Not paranoid. Just prepared. A flight attendant passed by with a drink cart. Camille asked for orange juice for Malcolm and a ginger ale for herself. When Malcolm received his drink, he grinned and said, "Thank you," with cheerful enthusiasm. The flight attendant smiled, "What good manners you have." Malcolm looked proud. Camille gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. Greg muttered something too low for most to hear. But Julian caught the word, "brats." Camille didn't react. She was trying to focus on Malcolm. But Julian noticed how her posture shifted slightly more protective now. A mother's instinct, quietly activated. Greg took a deep sip of his black coffee, eyes scanning the cabin. When they met Malcolm's again, his brow furrowed ever so slightly. Later, the fastened seatbelt sign dinged off. Some passengers got up to stretch or head to the lavatory. Camille pulled out a small storybook and began reading to Malcolm. He leaned against her, content, tracing the pictures with his finger. Greg shifted in his seat, groaning as if annoyed. Then, for the first time, he spoke out loud. "Can you keep it down? Some of us want peace." Camille turned, startled by the sharpness in his voice. "We're speaking quietly," she said, trying to stay composed. "I'm reading to my son." Greg scoffed. "Of course. Excuses." Malcolm looked up, confused. "What did I do?" "Nothing, baby," Camille said quickly, her voice tight. "You did nothing wrong." Julian heard it all. His eyes opened. His muscles tensed. He waited. Still not time to act. But close. Camille turned back toward the window. She didn't want to make a scene. But inside, her heart was pounding. It wasn't just the rudeness, it was something colder. Something more dangerous. She felt it in Greg's tone. In the way he didn't see her son as a child, but as a target. When Malcolm got up to go to the restroom, Camille helped guide him into the aisle. As they passed Greg, Malcolm accidentally brushed his elbow against Greg's knee. Greg jerked his leg back like he'd been stung. "Watch it," he hissed. Malcolm froze. Camille turned, her tone firm but calm. "He didn't mean to bump you. He's just trying to get by." Greg leaned forward slightly. "You people always think you're above the rules." The words hit like a slap. Camille's breath caught. Malcolm blinked, not fully understanding but sensing the shift. Julian stood again. This time, he made no excuse. He walked up the aisle and paused beside Camille. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, voice low and steady. Camille looked at him, hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, for now." Greg didn't look up. Julian's eyes lingered on him. "Just checking." Camille took Malcolm's hand and led him to the back. As they walked, she whispered, "It's okay, baby. You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people are just angry." Malcolm looked down. "Did I mess up?" Camille squeezed his hand. "No. Never." In the back galley, Camille pulled aside a flight attendant. "There's a man near our row," she said quietly. "He's being hostile. I think he's targeting my son." The attendant's expression changed immediately. "Thank you for telling me. We'll keep an eye out." "Do you feel unsafe?" Camille hesitated. "Not yet. But I want you to be aware. He's been saying things." The attendant nodded and made a note. "I'll alert the lead." As Camille and Malcolm returned to their seats, Julian caught her eye. She gave a grateful nod. Julian didn't nod back. He simply stood still, tall, calm, unwavering. A quiet signal to both Camille and Greg: "If something happens, I'm here." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane moved farther from Texas airspace and into smoother skies. Outside, clouds stretched like silent mountains, the sun glinting off their crests. Inside the aircraft, however, pressure was quietly building. Malcolm sat quietly now, fiddling with a blue pencil. His once excited chatter had dwindled into hesitant whispers. He no longer leaned against the window. Instead, he glanced toward his mother more often, seeking silent reassurances with his eyes. Camille tried to remain calm. Her fingers gently combed through Malcolm's short curls, but her gaze kept flickering toward Greg's seat across the aisle. The man hadn't said anything since their return from the restroom, but the silence felt louder than any insult. Greg sat stiffly, flipping through the in-flight magazine, his jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck bulged. Occasionally, his eyes flicked toward Malcolm, lingering just a moment too long. Julian had not returned to his seat. He stood now in the aisle a few rows back, arms crossed loosely, near the lavatory. Anyone watching might think he was just stretching or waiting his turn. But in truth, he was a sentinel. And he was watching Greg like a hawk. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with platinum blonde hair and a calm smile, approached quietly. She bent slightly toward Camille. "We're monitoring him," she whispered. "Let us know if anything changes." Camille nodded, gratitude in her eyes but also unease. She could feel it. Something was coming. Malcolm tried to return to his coloring book, but his lines wobbled. His fingers trembled slightly as he tried to stay within the dolphin's outline. He leaned closer to his mother. "Why is he still staring at us?" he whispered. Camille hesitated. "I don't know, sweetheart. But remember what I said, you haven't done anything wrong." From across the aisle, Greg slammed his magazine closed. The sharp crack of the laminated cover made Malcolm flinch. Camille's head snapped toward him, protective instinct surging through her chest like a current. Greg turned his head slowly, deliberately. His eyes met Camille's cold, hard, full of contempt. "You want to teach your kid to stay in his lane," he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "Would do him some good." Julian heard it. So did the flight attendant nearby. Camille's voice was calm, but shaking. "Don't speak to us again." Greg scoffed, loud and dismissive. "Of course. Can't say anything these days without someone whining." Other passengers began turning their heads. A murmur ran down the rows. One woman sitting ahead whispered to her husband, "Did he just say that to the kid?" Greg leaned back, arms crossed. But his face burned red, and his foot began bouncing, a sign Julian immediately clocked as a telltale sign of agitation teetering on the edge. Julian took a step forward, voice even and low. "Sir, I think you've made your point. Let's leave it there." Greg turned, eyes narrowing. "Who the hell are you? Air Marshal?" Julian didn't blink. "Just someone who doesn't want to see a child harassed." Greg stood. Camille stood immediately. So did Julian. The motion spread like ripples in a pond. A young man seated 2 rows up also rose to his feet, unsure what was happening, but sensing the crackle of danger in the air. Greg took one step into the aisle, eyes burning. "I've been patient," he said through clenched teeth. "But this is ridiculous. Some of us paid good money to not be surrounded by screaming." "She hasn't screamed once," Camille snapped. Her voice, finally unbound by caution, rang with fury. "He's a little boy, and he's done nothing wrong." Greg's nostrils flared. "You people always playing the victim." Gasps followed. Malcolm clutched his mother's arm, shrinking into his seat. Julian stepped fully into the aisle now, between Greg and Camille. "Back to your seat. Now." Greg's eyes danced from Julian's chest to his face. The Marine's stance was unyielding, muscles coiled, jaw set, eyes sharp. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Greg hesitated. But then, with a low growl, he lunged. Not toward Julian but toward Malcolm. It happened fast, so fast that Camille barely had time to react. Greg reached across the aisle, arm extended, hand aiming for the child as if to grab him, push him, or worse. Malcolm yelped. Camille shouted, lunging. But Julian was already in motion. With one swift, practiced movement, Julian intercepted Greg's arm mid-swing and twisted it backward. Greg cried out in pain as Julian slammed him back into his seat, pinning his arm to the tray table. The cabin erupted. Passengers yelled. Flight attendants ran forward. One older man stood to help but stopped when he saw that Julian had full control. His grip on Greg was like steel, firm, focused, and just restrained enough not to cause permanent damage. "Don't move," Julian growled, low and lethal. "Don't even breathe wrong." Greg thrashed, sputtering insults, spewing obscenities. Julian didn't flinch. "Get the restraints," he called to the flight crew. Camille had fallen to her knees, arms wrapped around Malcolm. The boy shook, eyes wide, lips trembling, but he wasn't crying yet. He just stared at Greg like trying to understand what had happened. "I got you," Camille whispered. "He won't touch you. I promise." The flight attendants returned with zip-tie cuffs, and together with Julian still holding Greg's arm pinned they secured his wrists. Greg's face twisted with hate. "I'll sue you all," he spat. "This is assault." A nearby passenger shouted, "You tried to hit a child, man. Sit down and shut up." Another, "We've got it on video." Phones were up everywhere. The lead flight attendant rushed to the intercom. "Captain, we have a security incident. We need to divert." Julian sat back slowly, breathing through his nose. His muscles still braced, ready for any second wave. He looked at Camille and Malcolm. Then he spoke, calm and clear. "It's over. You're safe now." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a security situation on board, we will be making an emergency landing in Albuquerque. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The word sent a hush through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others leaned over the aisles, whispering furiously. But no one asked questions. They had seen what happened. The image of a grown man lunging at a child was burned into every mind on board. Julian remained standing next to Greg, who was now slumped in his seat, wrists bound with thick plastic ties. He was panting, red-faced, sweating, fuming but subdued. For now. Camille hadn't let go of Malcolm. The boy clutched her shirt tightly, burying his face in her shoulder. He was trembling, not crying, not speaking. Just shaking. As if his small body didn't yet understand what had happened, but instinctively knew it wasn't safe. The lead flight attendant knelt beside them, her voice hushed. "We have medical and law enforcement waiting on the ground. Are you okay? Do either of you need assistance?" Camille took a shaky breath, still holding Malcolm. "He didn't hit him, thanks to that man," she said, nodding toward Julian. "But, my son's terrified. And I'm not doing great either." The attendant nodded gently. "We'll have paramedics check you both. Please let us know if anything changes." Julian finally sat down across the aisle, his eyes never leaving Greg. He didn't trust him for a second. Even cuffed, the man radiated a kind of coiled malice, like something venomous forced into a cage. Greg hadn't said another word since his outburst, but the twitch in his jaw and the hate in his eyes made it clear, the silence was temporary. The flight began to descend. Malcolm flinched when the landing gear thudded into place. Camille gently brushed a hand through his hair. "We're almost there, baby. Just hold on." Malcolm whispered something. She leaned closer. "I didn't do anything wrong, right?" The words pierced her heart. Camille tightened her grip. "No, baby. You did everything right. He's the one who was wrong. You were perfect." The plane landed to a runway lined with flashing lights. Paramedics and uniformed officers stood at the ready as the aircraft taxied to a secure gate, isolated from the rest of the airport. As soon as the doors opened, 2 officers boarded swiftly. They moved with purpose, their expressions unreadable. Julian stood again. "He's restrained," he told them. "Tried to strike a minor. I intervened." The officers nodded. They replaced the zip ties with steel handcuffs, pulling Greg to his feet. He started to resist, but quickly realized it was useless. The officer's grip was unforgiving, and his attempt at defiance only earned him a harder shove toward the exit. As Greg was led down the aisle, passengers stared, recording silently with their phones. A few whispered curses under their breath. One woman muttered, "Coward." Another, "Monster." Greg didn't speak. His eyes flicked toward Malcolm and Camille as he passed, filled with the same bitter contempt. Julian shifted slightly into his path, blocking the boy from view. That was the last Greg saw before he was removed from the plane. Paramedics came next. One knelt beside Malcolm and spoke gently. "Hi there, buddy. I'm here to make sure you're okay. Can I check your hands real quick?" Malcolm nodded silently. They checked for bruises, swelling, anything that might indicate an injury. Camille was examined too, though she declined a full check, saying she just needed to breathe. Julian stood nearby, answering questions from the police. He gave a full account, clear and concise, explaining how Greg had grown increasingly aggressive throughout the flight, culminating in the attempted assault. Camille, now calmer, approached one of the officers with Malcolm still holding her hand. "I want to make a statement," she said. "He targeted my son from the moment we sat down." The officer nodded. "You'll have that chance. We'd also like to record your account formally once you're inside." She glanced at Julian. "Will he be a witness?" Julian answered before the officer could. "Absolutely." Inside the terminal, the airline staff arranged a quiet room away from the chaos of arriving passengers. Camille, Malcolm, Julian, and a few officers sat together while statements were taken. Tissues, bottled water, and small comforts were quietly offered by airport personnel who seemed genuinely shaken by what had occurred. Malcolm still hadn't spoken much. At one point, an officer knelt down beside him, removing her cap. "You were really brave today," she said softly. Malcolm looked up at her, unsure. She smiled kindly. "I mean it. You didn't do anything wrong, okay? And we're going to make sure he can't hurt anyone again." For the first time since the incident, Malcolm gave a small nod. Outside the room, Greg was being processed. Charges were already stacking: attempted assault of a minor, public endangerment, disorderly conduct, and pending review hate crime enhancement. Word of his past behavior had begun to surface as well: prior complaints, aggressive outbursts, racial slurs caught on audio in other public incidents. He wouldn't be walking away from this easily. Meanwhile, Camille sat beside Julian as she filled out paperwork, her hands still trembling slightly. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, voice low. "If you hadn't stepped in." Julian shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. I saw something wrong, and I did what anyone should have done." "Not everyone would have," she said. She looked at Malcolm, now quietly sketching with a donated pen and paper. "You stopped something awful from scarring him for life." Julian followed her gaze. "Let's just make sure he knows it wasn't his fault." Camille nodded. "That's my mission from here on out." Outside, Albuquerque's golden light poured through the windows. The day had taken a dark turn, but for Camille and Malcolm, a quiet hope began to settle in, the knowledge that they were believed, supported, and no longer alone. By the time Camille and Malcolm were escorted to their hotel in Albuquerque that evening, the footage was already online. Shot from two angles by passengers seated nearby, the video showed a man, Greg Mathers, lunging at a small black boy on a flight. One clip captured the exact moment Julian intervened, locking Greg's arm in a swift, practiced motion. The sound of passengers gasping, shouting, and one woman crying out, "He tried to hit that child," echoed through the audio. It spread like wildfire. By morning, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Protect Black Children. Hashtag Flight 276 Incident. Hashtag Hero Marine. News outlets picked it up quickly. Headlines ranged from outrage to clinical. Man attempts to strike child mid-flight, Marine intervenes. Racist attack averted on plane, bystander praised for swift action. Flight diverted after hate-fueled altercation. Camille hadn't checked her phone since the hotel check-in. She sat on the bed with Malcolm curled against her side, watching cartoons at a low volume. She held his hand while brushing his cheek with the other, trying to help him feel grounded again. There was a knock at the door. Julian stood there with a paper bag in hand. "I figured you two might not want to go down to the lobby," he said. Camille offered a tired smile. "You're right. Thank you." He handed her the food sandwiches, juice, and some apple slices for Malcolm. "Anything on the news yet?" she asked, unsure whether she even wanted the answer. Julian nodded. "It's everywhere." Camille exhaled. "God." He hesitated before stepping inside. "I know this might sound overwhelming, but it could work in your favor. Public pressure helps. And the charges they're taking this seriously." "They should," Camille said, her voice tight. "My son was targeted on a plane. He's 9. Julian looked at Malcolm, who was slowly nibbling on a slice of apple. "How's he doing?" Camille glanced at her boy. "Quiet. Clingy. But, holding together." Julian nodded. "He's tougher than he looks." The next day, the district attorney's office reached out. Camille was asked to give a formal statement. A victim's advocate was assigned to walk her through the legal process. Greg Mathers was being held without bail while the case was under review. The hate crime enhancement was officially on the table. Camille's hand trembled when she signed her name at the bottom of the report. "This is really happening," she said to no one in particular. The advocate nodded. "Yes, and you're not alone." Meanwhile, Julian's face was already circulating online. He had never wanted fame. In fact, during his 12 years of service in the Marines, he had gone to great lengths to remain invisible. He worked behind the scenes, protected others from the shadows. But now, without his permission, the world had labeled him a hero. Some articles focused entirely on him. "Retired Marine stops in-flight assault. Courage in the sky, the man who stepped up." Julian gave a single interview, just one, with the intention of shifting the focus back to Malcolm. "I appreciate the kind words," he told the reporter, "but this isn't about me. It's about a child who was almost harmed simply for existing in his own skin. We can't keep letting that happen." Back in Dallas, Camille's sister Rhonda saw the story unfold on her phone, her breakfast going cold. She dropped everything and booked the first flight to Albuquerque. By that evening, she was at their hotel room door, arms wrapping around Camille and Malcolm in a tearful embrace. "You don't have to do this alone," she whispered. Camille broke down. The wall she had carefully kept up for Malcolm's sake finally cracked. She let herself cry, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of having to stay strong. Malcolm, meanwhile, clung to Rhonda like he'd been holding his breath since the plane landed. The next morning, Camille finally read through the online comments. Her stomach tightened as she scrolled. That man should never see the outside of a jail again. Thank God for the Marine. What if he hadn't been there? No child should have to go through that. Ever. This is America in 2025. Still fighting demons we should have buried long ago. Some comments were uglier. Trolls and cynics always found their way in, but the overwhelming tone was one of solidarity, anger, and support. Her inbox overflowed. Messages from strangers. From civil rights groups. From trauma counselors offering pro bono sessions. Even a law firm offered assistance if she wanted to pursue a civil case. Camille closed the laptop. Her head throbbed. It was all too much. She turned to Julian, who had been sitting quietly near the window of the hotel suite, sipping coffee. "What happens now?" she asked. Julian set his cup down. "Now? We take it one step at a time. You help Malcolm heal. You give your statement. And if it comes to court, I'll be there. Camille nodded slowly. I don't want him to be defined by this. He won't be, Julian said. But the world might change a little because of it. Camille looked at her son, who was sketching again in a new notebook. This time, he was drawing a plane. In the sky, among the clouds, a small superhero figure hovered beside it, broad shoulders, cape fluttering. She smiled, misty-eyed. Maybe he wasn't drawing Spider-Man this time. Maybe he was drawing someone real. 2 weeks later, Camille stood in front of a courthouse in downtown Albuquerque, her heart pounding like a war drum. The sandstone walls towered above her, sunlight beating down on the steps. She held Malcolm's hand tightly. He was dressed in his best shirt, face solemn but calm. Beside them was Julian, in a navy blazer, clean-shaven and steady as ever. His presence was a quiet anchor in a storm of nerves. Inside, the preliminary hearing for State versus Greg Mathers was about to begin. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Camille whispered. Julian's reply was simple. You already are. The prosecutor's assistant led them through the metal detectors, into a waiting room just outside the courtroom. There, a victim's advocate sat with Malcolm, offering juice, crayons, and a gentle smile. Camille had been given the option of shielding Malcolm from the actual hearing, but the boy had insisted. I want to hear the judge say he was wrong. Even at 9, he understood something powerful: being seen, and being heard, was part of healing. The courtroom was silent when they entered, carpeted in muted tones, walls lined with polished wood, and the judge's bench looming like a stage. Reporters weren't allowed inside, but a few sat in the hallway waiting for updates. At the far end of the room sat Greg Mathers. He wore a wrinkled gray suit. His wrists were unshackled for the appearance, but the faint marks of the cuffs were still visible. His expression was cold, unreadable, but his eyes flickered just for a second when they landed on Camille and Malcolm. Camille instinctively shifted to block Malcolm's view. Julian stood beside them, unflinching. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Be seated, came the deep voice, calm but commanding. The proceedings began. The prosecution went first, laying out the charges in a clear, measured tone. Mr. Mathers acted in a manner both physically aggressive and racially charged, the attorney stated. He attempted to assault a child, required restraint mid-flight, and caused such disruption that a commercial aircraft had to divert and land. Camille stared straight ahead. Julian listened with military focus. Malcolm's hand was on his mother's knee, his small fingers tapping rhythmically, like he was counting seconds. Then came the defense. Greg's attorney, a man in his early 50s with slick back hair and a too-smooth voice, tried to frame the incident as a moment of frustration, that his client had been sleep-deprived, triggered by noise, and that the interaction was blown out of proportion due to heightened tensions. Camille felt her stomach twist. She clenched her fists in her lap. Then came the defense's worst card. He never intended to strike the child, the lawyer claimed. There was a misunderstanding. He stumbled during turbulence, and the Marine Mr. Briggs overreacted. Julian's eyes narrowed. Camille looked at him, lips parted in disbelief. But the prosecutor stood up slowly, and with confidence, played the video. No sound. Just the silent footage: Greg's snarl, his lunge across the aisle, Julian intercepting and slamming him down. Even without audio, the truth was undeniable. Gasps echoed softly around the room. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly as he scribbled something down. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes now downcast. Next, Camille was called to testify. She stood, straightened her shoulders, and walked to the witness stand. She placed her hand on the Bible, then sat as instructed. The prosecutor guided her with gentleness. Camille described the flight, Greg's glare, his muttered insults, the moment he reached toward her son. Her voice cracked only once when she said, Malcolm didn't even understand what was happening. He just knew that someone hated him. and he didn't know why. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even Greg looked away. On cross-examination, the defense tried to trip her up. "Did your son ever scream or shout excessively during the flight?" "He talked. He laughed. He's a child." "So, he was loud." "He was alive," Camille snapped. "Since when is joy a provocation?" The defense attorney blinked, caught off guard. The judge gave a small nod, not of approval, but recognition. That line would echo later. Julian was next. His testimony was clean, factual, and powerful. He described Greg's escalating behavior, his body language, and the exact moment of the lunge. "You are trained in threat assessment, correct?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Julian replied. 12 years in the Marine Corps, including security operations. "So, in your professional opinion, was this a threat?" Julian looked the judge in the eye. "It wasn't just a threat. It was an attack in progress. And I stopped it." Greg's lawyer tried to suggest overreaction, but Julian remained stone still. "I've been in real combat zones," he said calmly. This wasn't panic. This was instinct and experience. When the judge adjourned, there was no verdict that would come later. But his parting words were clear: based on the evidence and testimony, this matter will proceed to full trial. Greg's jaw tightened. Malcolm watched as the bailiff returned to cuff him. This time, Greg didn't resist. He glanced at the boy just once, but Malcolm didn't look away. He held his mother's hand and stared back. Strong. Silent. Unbroken. Outside the courtroom, the prosecutor met them. "You did great," she said softly. "Both of you. We'll be in touch about the trial." Camille nodded. Malcolm tugged at Julian's sleeve. "Did I do okay?" he whispered. Julian knelt beside him. "You were brave. You stood tall. That matters more than anything." Malcolm gave a small smile. And for the first time in weeks, it reached his eyes. 3 weeks had passed since the preliminary hearing. Summer had begun to shift toward fall, but for Camille, time no longer followed the weather. Her world now moved to the rhythm of court dates, legal calls, and the quiet needs of a boy who no longer laughed the same way. The district attorney's office had officially scheduled Greg Mathers's trial. The charges stood: attempted assault of a minor, public endangerment, and hate crime enhancement. A conviction on all counts could result in significant prison time and finally, some form of justice. But Camille wasn't thinking about the courtroom. She was thinking about Malcolm, and how he hadn't colored anything bright in weeks. His drawings were now shades of gray, sketched plains and dark clouds, sometimes with a small stick figure standing alone. The sparkle in his eyes hadn't vanished completely, but it had dimmed. Camille could see it every time he tried to smile and couldn't quite finish. One afternoon, while folding laundry, she heard him talking to someone in the next room. Not to her. Not to Julian. Just softly, to his stuffed lion. "Do you think people hate me? Or just what I look like?" Camille froze. Her knees nearly gave out. Julian came over that evening. He didn't knock, he never did anymore. He understood that when a family walks through something like this, formalities fall away. Camille sat on the couch, the news muted in the background. Malcolm was at the kitchen table, gluing shapes onto construction paper without much enthusiasm. "He's hurting in ways I can't reach," she said quietly. Julian sat beside her. "He's processing. It'll take time." She looked at him. "Do you ever forget the things that change you?" Julian was silent for a long moment. "No. But you learn to carry them better." She leaned her head on his shoulder, just for a second. "I want him to grow from this, not around it," she whispered. "I don't want the scar to define him." Julian didn't answer. He didn't need to. His presence was the answer. The prosecutor assigned them a trial coach, a trauma-informed specialist whose role was to prepare victims and witnesses for court. Her name was Rosa, and she had kind eyes, a calm voice, and a clipboard that never left her side. "Courtrooms aren't made for comfort," she told Camille on their first meeting. "But we'll make sure you both are ready." She met with Camille privately first, walking her through the questions that might come up, the tricks defense attorneys might use, and most importantly how to stay grounded when everything felt like it was spinning. "I'm not worried about telling the truth," Camille said. "I'm worried I'll forget how to breathe when I do." Rosa smiled. "That's why we practice." They rehearsed her testimony, over and over, until Camille's voice no longer cracked when she said, "He reached for my son like he wasn't human." Malcolm's sessions were gentler. Rosa used coloring books, stuffed animals, and storytelling to help him express what he felt. Instead of saying, "What happened on the plane?" she would ask, "Can you draw the day you felt scared?" He did. And over time, the dark clouds in his drawings lightened. One day, he even drew a plane flying through the storm, not trapped beneath it. On the tail of the aircraft, he wrote a tiny M. Rosa hung that picture in her office. Julian continued to check in, always quiet, always steady. He joined Camille for the final pre-trial meeting, sitting beside her as the lead prosecutor outlined the schedule, the jury selection, and the potential outcomes. "If this goes well," the prosecutor said, "he'll be convicted. And that will be on the public record. Forever." Camille nodded. "And if it doesn't?" The prosecutor hesitated. "We still tell the truth. That's all we can do." Julian spoke for the first time. "That man may walk into court in a suit. But we all saw who he really is. So will the jury." Camille looked at him, and for a moment, felt something she hadn't in a long time. Certainty. The night before the trial, Camille tucked Malcolm into bed early. He held his lion close, eyes wide in the dark. "Will I have to talk?" "Only if you want to," Camille said gently. "I already told the judge everything." Malcolm was quiet for a moment. "Can I say something if I want to?" Camille smiled. "Yes, baby. You can say whatever you want." He nodded. Then whispered, "I just want them to know I didn't do anything wrong." Camille leaned down and kissed his forehead. "They'll know. And even if they don't, I'll never forget who you are." She sat by his side long after he drifted off, her hand resting over his. This wasn't just about a trial anymore. It was about identity. About reclaiming power. About reminding the world and her son that his worth was never up for debate. Tomorrow, the court would hear their story again. This time, the world would be watching. The courthouse was busier than usual that morning. Security lines stretched through the marble-floored lobby, reporters clustered near the entrance, and courthouse staff buzzed with quiet urgency. It wasn't just another case on the docket, it was a story the public had already begun to claim as their own. The state of New Mexico versus Gregory Allen Mathers. A man accused of attempting to assault a child mid-flight, with racial animus at the core of his actions. The case had become a flashpoint in national discourse about race, trauma, and who gets protected in public spaces. Camille stood near the courtroom doors, dressed simply in navy blue, her shoulders squared though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Beside her, Malcolm wore a pressed white shirt and slacks, holding his stuffed lion, not in fear, but like a soldier might hold a shield. Julian arrived in uniform, his testimony carried more weight that way. Not the dress blues, but the civilian service attire retired Marines often wore for official matters. His steps were measured, his jaw tight. He gave Camille a nod. "Ready?" Camille looked down at Malcolm, who looked up at her. They nodded together. "Yes," she said. "Let's finish this." Inside, the jury had already been selected. 12 men and women sat with notepads ready, their expressions neutral, yet quietly attentive. The judge, the same one from the preliminary hearing, called the room to order. Greg Mathers sat at the defendant's table in another rumpled gray suit. His eyes darted toward Camille, then toward Malcolm, but quickly dropped. For once, there was no arrogance in his posture, only the slow, creeping realization that this was not going away. The prosecution began with a powerful opening statement. "This case is not about misunderstanding," the attorney said. "It's about a grown man who chose to intimidate, belittle, and ultimately attempt to harm a child, because of that child's race. You will hear testimony, see evidence, and watch video that shows not only what Mr. Mathers did, but why he did it." Then the defense spoke. They leaned into emotional stress, claustrophobia, and overreaction. The attorney claimed the incident had been tragically misinterpreted, and that the act was clumsy, not criminal. Camille's stomach churned. Then the witnesses began. The flight attendant went first. She described Greg's escalating complaints, his comments about Malcolm, and how his behavior grew, increasingly hostile and aggressive. She recounted the exact moment she saw him rise from his seat and reach across the aisle. "I've worked in aviation for 17 years, she said. "I've seen turbulence. I've seen arguments. This wasn't either. This was a man trying to attack a little boy." Next came a fellow passenger, a mother from California who had sat just behind Greg. "He muttered about the family non-stop," she testified. "When the child laughed, he sighed. When the mother spoke, he rolled his eyes. And when he stood, I've never seen someone move with that kind of intent unless they meant to do harm." Then came Julian. As he took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. He answered each question calmly, with clarity and authority. "No, I wasn't on duty. No, I wasn't armed. But I was trained to assess risk. And from the moment that man stepped into the aisle, I knew he was going to do something." "Did you witness him make contact with the child?" "No," Julian said, "because I stopped him first." "And why did you intervene?" Julian looked at Malcolm. "Because I've seen what happens when good people look away." Then it was Camille's turn. She stepped up to the stand, her hands trembling only slightly as she was sworn in. The prosecutor guided her gently through her testimony. She described the beginning of the flight, Malcolm's excitement, Greg's glares, his words, "You people always think you're above the rules." Then came the moment. "The second I saw his body shift," Camille said, voice firm, "I knew. It wasn't about noise. It wasn't about space. It was about hate." She paused. "I saw it in his eyes. He looked at my son like he wasn't human." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Even the court reporters' hands paused, just briefly. The defense cross-examined, trying to rattle her, but Camille held fast. "So you believe my client is racist?" Camille didn't hesitate. "I don't believe it," she said. "I saw it. And so did everyone else." Finally, Malcolm was given the chance to speak, not under pressure, but offered the floor, if he wished. He stood beside his mother, lion clutched tightly, and said in a soft, clear voice, "I was just being happy. That man looked at me like I shouldn't be. Like I was bad for laughing. The courtroom was still. And I didn't do anything wrong." The judge blinked hard. The jury stared at the boy as if time itself had slowed. When the prosecution rested, there was no dramatic twist, no surprise witnesses. Only truth. Quiet, heavy, undeniable. The defense attempted to redirect blame, minimize harm, cast shadows, but the light had already come in. After closing arguments, the judge gave instructions to the jury. They filed out. The room exhaled. Camille sat beside Julian, gripping Malcolm's hand. No matter what the verdict would be, she knew they had done everything they could. The truth was now out there. Carved into the court record. Etched into the nation's consciousness. And sitting bravely on the bench beside her was living proof that the smallest voice can carry the greatest weight when someone is willing to listen. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. For Camille, each minute stretched like taut wire, fraying at the edges of her composure. She and Malcolm waited in a private lounge provided by the court, a quiet room filled with donated snacks and muted tones that did little to soothe the anxiety humming in her chest. Julian paced the hallway outside like a soldier on patrol, silent, focused, but ready to act at a moment's notice. Malcolm sat cross-legged on the couch, flipping through the pages of a worn comic book. Every few minutes, he glanced up at his mother, then down at his lion, as if trying to pretend nothing was different, while knowing everything was. A gentle knock. The prosecutor stepped into the room. "They've reached a verdict," she said quietly. Camille's throat closed up. Malcolm looked up, eyes wide. Julian re-entered. "Whatever happens in there," he said, kneeling beside Malcolm, "you stood strong. You told the truth. No verdict can ever take that away." Malcolm nodded, lips pressed together. Camille took a deep breath and stood, her knees slightly trembling. "Let's go finish this." The courtroom was packed when they returned. A handful of local reporters had been granted limited access, but the seats were mostly filled with quiet, anxious citizens, teachers, neighbors, retired veterans, college students, people who had seen the video, heard the story, and wanted to be present for its conclusion. Greg Mathers sat stone-faced, flanked by his attorney, who whispered urgently in his ear. But Greg's eyes didn't flicker toward Camille this time. The judge called the room to order. The bailiff asked the jury to rise. 12 solemn faces stood in perfect silence. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. A woman in the front row, a middle-aged juror with graying hair and red-framed glasses, nodded. "We have, Your Honor." She handed a folded paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge unfolded it slowly. He read it once to himself. Then aloud. "On the count of attempted assault of a minor, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of public endangerment aboard a commercial aircraft, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of racially motivated hate crime enhancement, we find the defendant guilty." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Camille gasped. Julian closed his eyes for half a second, then nodded once like a mission had been completed. Malcolm leaned against his mother and whispered, "He heard me." Camille wrapped her arms around her son and held him close, eyes brimming with tears. They had been seen. Believed. Protected. Greg's face turned a shade darker. His attorney sat still, expression hollow. A guard moved behind Greg with quiet authority. The trial was over. But the consequences were only just beginning. The judge turned to Greg. "Sentencing will be held in 2 weeks. You will remain in custody until that time." Greg stood as the bailiff guided him toward the side door. There was no struggle. No speech. Just the heavy sound of chains brushing against fabric. And then he was gone. Outside the courthouse, a cluster of reporters waited. Camille shielded Malcolm's face and gave no interviews. Julian stood beside them, arms folded, creating a human wall between them and the world. Later, in the quiet of their hotel room, Camille finally let herself cry, really cry, not from fear or anger, but from the release of carrying something heavy for too long. "I didn't think they'd believe us," she whispered. "They didn't have a choice," Julian said gently. "The truth was too loud." She looked at him through tears. "You think that'll be enough for Malcolm?" Julian turned to the boy, who sat nearby holding his lion. "It already is," he said. In the following days, messages poured in again. Letters from teachers, from parents, from strangers who had been following the case from across the country. People who had once been silent found the courage to speak about their own experiences with racism, with injustice, with fear. One letter came from a teacher in Wisconsin. "Because of your son, I changed my lesson plans this week. We're talking about courage. And I used his story. Another, from a father in Georgia, I showed the video to my son. He asked if he could be like Malcolm when he grows up. Camille read each one out loud to Malcolm, who listened in silence, sometimes smiling, sometimes turning away. But he was hearing them. Letting them in. 2 weeks later, Greg Mathers was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with an additional 3-year enhancement for the hate crime conviction. The judge delivered the sentence without flourish. He spoke of the need to protect children, the severity of bias-fueled violence, and the courage it took for a young boy to stand up and speak the truth in the face of trauma. Greg said nothing. Camille and Malcolm were not in the courtroom that day. They were in a small park in Portland, finally finishing the trip they never got to take. The wind was cool. The sky was wide. And Malcolm's laughter, real, full, and unburdened, rang through the air as he flew a small toy plane high above the grass. Camille watched him run, arms outstretched, and let herself believe truly that the worst was behind them. Julian sat on the bench beside her. "You did it," he said. Camille shook her head. "He did it." She looked toward her son. "And I think, he's finally starting to fly again." 6 months later, the world had moved on. News cycles had shifted. Social media trends had turned to different names, different injustices, different calls for justice. But for Camille and Malcolm, healing was still a quiet, daily act, one not measured in headlines or hashtags, but in moments. Like the moment Malcolm went back to school and didn't flinch when someone laughed too loudly in class. Like the moment he stood up in front of the entire 3rd grade, holding a paper lion in one hand and said, "This is my bravery. It sits on my desk now. So I don't forget." Or the day he walked into therapy and, instead of drawing clouds and turbulence, he drew sunlight streaming through the airplane window, with a small stick figure smiling. His counselor framed it. Camille had changed too. She began speaking at local community events, gatherings at libraries, churches, schools. Not as a lawyer or activist. Just as a mother. She didn't always talk about what happened on that flight. Sometimes she talked about what happened afterward, how to raise a child in a world that doesn't always see his full humanity. How to build safety in spaces that don't offer it. How to survive the storm and teach your child that the sky still belongs to him. "I didn't want to be a public figure," she once told a room full of parents, but silence was never an option. Not after what he went through. People listened. They cried. They wrote down her words like scripture. She had never set out to become a symbol. But sometimes, symbols are forged through fire. Julian, for his part, returned to a quieter life. But not for long. He began working with a youth mentoring program, teaching self-defense, discipline, and emotional strength to young boys, especially boys of color. His class was called Stand Strong. He never mentioned Malcolm by name, but every lesson began the same: we don't fight to hurt. We stand to protect. The strongest thing you'll ever do is stop something from becoming violence. The boys listened. Because Julian didn't speak like a hero. He spoke like a man who had seen pain and chosen not to pass it forward. Every few weeks, he would visit Camille and Malcolm. Sometimes just to drop off groceries or check in. Sometimes just to sit on the porch and say nothing at all. Camille started baking again, something she had stopped doing during the trial. Malcolm said her lemon muffins were almost heroic. Life didn't go back to normal. It became something new. Stronger. One spring morning, nearly a year after the flight, Camille surprised Malcolm with a trip to a small aviation museum just outside Portland. It was filled with old airplanes, flight simulators, and retired pilots who answered questions like teachers with wings. Malcolm's eyes widened as he walked through the hangar. He ran his fingers along the metal belly of a prop plane, sat in the cockpit of a 1960s simulator, and asked every question he could think of. At one point, a volunteer leaned down and asked, you want to be a pilot, kid? Malcolm looked up. Smiled. No. I want to build planes. Planes that keep everyone safe. Camille felt her chest rise with something deeper than pride. It was hope, reborn. As they left, Malcolm turned back one last time to wave at the planes. You know, he said, I used to think that sky didn't want me. Camille tilted her head. Why's that? Because I flew once, he said, and it almost broke me. She crouched down, looked him in the eye. But it didn't, she said. He nodded. Yeah. That's the part one remember now. He reached into his backpack and pulled out his old Lion, the same one from the flight. I think I'm ready to let him fly now, too. Camille blinked back tears. They stood in silence as the boy held the stuffed lion up to the breeze. The wind caught its mane, fluttered its arms. And in that simple act, something in both of them lifted. Not forgotten. Not erased. But lightened. Back home, Malcolm began writing a story for school. It was titled, The Day the Lion Didn't Roar, but Still Won. At the bottom of the final page, he drew a boy looking out the airplane window. Above him were clouds, birds, and stars. And just above that, in crooked handwriting that still made his mother cry when she saw it, the sky is mine now.